Hello everyone, and welcome back to another FromSoft lore video. In previous videos, we've often explored the wide variety of historical and cultural references across Soulsborne titles. It's certainly true that FromSoft do draw on an impressive range of sources and also have plenty of completely original ideas thrown in, but they also take inspiration from closer to home. And so in this video, I want to do a roundup of some Japanese folklore and mythology that has found its way into their games. Some of this relates to objects of special significance, some of it comes from the Shinto and Buddhist theology that runs through the Japanese thought tradition, and an especially great deal comes from folklore figures. One very illuminating thing to keep in mind when we discuss legendary figures, especially the very ancient ones, is that many of them can be read as metaphors for natural disasters. Japan, as well as being one of the most beautiful places on Earth, is also one of the most geologically hazardous, and for as long as people have inhabited it, they have been keenly aware of being at the mercy of nature. But enough introductions, I want to begin with some important artifacts. One source of inspiration for a number of inclusions across FromSoft titles is the Imperial Regalia of Japan. Unlike most Western monarchies whose main regalia consists of crown jewels, the Japanese regalia is a collection of 3 sacred treasures, the provenance of which supports the divine right of the imperial household, a lineage they traditionally trace back through a number of semi-legendary figures all the way back to the Shinto gods. The treasures consist of a sword, a centerpiece jewel from a set of beads, and a bronze mirror. These are probably the most sacrosanct objects in all of Japan. For security reasons, they are housed separately. No one knows exactly what they look like because no one is allowed to look at them. They are concealed in reliquaries and only ever brought out to be presented to the emperor as part of his enthronement. The sword, jewel, and mirror as a trio of objects is a widely used motif in Japanese media, but the items also each have their own backstory which informs their inclusion in FromSoft games. The sword has its origins in the story of the Orochi, a beast commonly depicted as a dragon, but whose description in literature is much more vague, having 8 heads and tails, the size and shape of several valleys, being covered in moss and trees, and having a belly inflamed with fire. In other words, it personifies a volcanic eruption over Japan, one of the greatest possible calamities in the country. The god Susanoo, who we'll mention again later, saved the princess by tricking it into drinking 8 barrels of sake and then beheaded it once it had become intoxicated. He then proceeded to cut off its tails and, whilst doing so, discovered the sword within one of them, which he named the Heavenly Sword of Gathering Clouds. This story occupies a similar position in Japanese folklore as Excalibur does in Arthurian legend. Long-time FromSoft fans will instantly recognise the motif of secret tail weapons from bosses like Priscilla and Seath. Elden Ring puts a fresh spin on the idea. Again, we have our many-faced volcanic monstrosity who has a sword hidden within, only this time he fights us with it. Several generations later, the sword was in the possession of the legendary warrior Yamato Takeru. On a hunting trip, he was lured into open grassland by a treacherous warlord who had flaming arrows fired into the grass in an attempt to kill him. Yamato Takeru used the sword to hack away the long grass from around him and discovered that the sword possessed the power to control the winds. He defeated his enemies by sweeping the blaze back at them, and the sword acquired its current name, the Grass-Cutting Sword. Again, swords and other weapons with wind and storm abilities have long been soul staples and possibly have their origins here. We'll come on to true dragons later, but while we're on dragon-adjacent creatures like the Orochi, I just want to bring in the Hydra. The many-headed beast we fight in Dark Souls is not a true Hydra in the Western sense, because as we can see from its model, it has not one but several tails like the Japanese Orochi. The Hydra does, however, make an appearance in Elden Ring, even if by name only. The Hydra, which means water because it lived in a lake, was from Lerna, and its Greek name, Lenea Hydra, when transliterated through Japanese, comes out as Liurnia of the water, or lakes. One of the more subtle inclusions of Japanese mythology in Elden Ring is, in fact, a reference to one of the most important legends of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Her mythos is profoundly linked to Japan's cultural and spiritual identity. This is, after all, the land of the rising sun. Whilst fighting the Shadow Tree avatar, you may have noticed the pattern of lights on the seed head, which represents a constellation, although slightly warped to fit into a round. I originally thought it was supposed to be the plough, which misleadingly also has solar connotations in Japanese mythology, but it is in fact the Pleiades. The Japanese name for this cluster is Subaru, which means gathered together, which also lends its name and star symbolism to a popular Japanese automobile manufacturer. The Pleiades become prominent in the autumn and at its brightest in winter. For this reason, it was a useful site in pre-modern times for agriculture. Subaru, near the zenith after sunset in winter, would have indicated the sun being near winter solstice, a point significant for predicting the return of spring and a welcome sight for those ancient agricultural people braving the harsh Japanese winter. The importance of the Pleiades, or Subaru, is elaborated in Japanese mythology in a way which explains their appearance on the Shadow Tree avatar. After a fight with her brother Susanoo, Amaterasu hid in a cave. The other gods tried to entice her to return by displaying a mirror and her jewels on a branch. Significantly, the term Sumaru no Tama, or collection of beads, is used in the text and not a more colloquial term like fuchi for a string of beads. The story is an allegorical account of the sun's departure in winter and references how the Subaru cluster heralds the return of its warmth in spring. Its appearance on the Shadow Tree avatar is therefore sadly ironic, a sunflower with no more hope of seeing the sun. The final treasure is the bronze mirror, which was hung on the branch alongside the beads to entice Amaterasu out of the cave. There are mirrored armor pieces in Soulsborne games, especially Elden Ring, but up till now no actual mirror item of any particular importance, so that's something to watch out for in future titles. Those sacred objects have solid archaeological significance, but FromSoft draws plenty of inspiration from the theological thought tradition in Shinto. I think the Scarlet Rot and the plotline with Miquella's Needle is informed by the Shinto creation myth, with the gods Izanami and Izanagi, who, from their union, created the islands that form Japan and bore children who represent various forces of nature. After Izanami died giving birth to the god of fire, Izanagi, in his anger, killed the child so violently that his blood splattered the rocks and formed volcanoes. The grieving Izanagi then went down to the underworld. When he looked on Izanami, despite her pleas not to, he discovered she was now a hideous rotting corpse, and in his horror fled back to the world of the living. After his ordeal, he cleansed himself with water, allegedly beginning the custom of washing at Japanese temples. Ritual purity is of paramount importance in Shinto, and we can see from its founding mythology that death, rottenness, and any other form of impurity are considered abhorrent. A couple of quick points before we relate that back to Miquella. This idea of ritual washing at sacred shrines is seen in the way that churches and temples are usually presented as having a basin rather than an altar as the focal point. Another point of inspiration there is that the Miko or shrine maidens were historically the shamanic priestesses who performed divine rites at Shinto shrines. This has parallels with the shrine maidens in the hub areas of Soulsborne games, who also possess mystical abilities. The Firekeepers, Maiden in Black, Doll and Finger Reader all fill this role in their own way. Returning to Izanagi, there is a parallel between Gwyn from Dark Souls and Izanagi at this point in the story, who, whilst washing himself, produced his most important offspring from the water which flowed away from his eyes, ears and nose. They were Amaterasu, the sun goddess, Tsukuyomi, the moon god of uncertain gender, and Susanoo, a tempestuous character broadly associated with storms and the forces of nature. Gwyn's children were likewise Guinevere for the sun, Gwyndolin for the dark sun, let's say the moon, who was raised as a daughter despite being male, and the nameless king for the storms. Both Gwyn and Izanagi had other children, but those three are usually taken together as a prominent unit. But back to the main point about cleanliness. Shintoism is a profoundly physical spirituality which, as we said, places great emphasis on ritual purity and views death as ritually polluted. Bodily fluids, rotten food, and anything else unclean are not permitted within the confines of Shinto shrines for this reason. This is deeply ingrained in Japanese culture, which is assiduously clean and where almost obscene amounts of plastic get used to keep things as untouched as possible. It's a perspective which shows through clearly in Elden Ring, especially in Miquella's attempt to use the purity of unalloyed gold to combat the Scarlet Rot. Gold, as you may know, is a very soft or malleable metal, usually alloyed with stronger elements such as silver or copper to make it strong enough to withstand use in jewellery. Its purity is measured in 20/4 as caratage. 18 karat gold therefore is a valuable alloy containing 75% gold, whereas 9 karat gold is much lower quality, cheaper but liable to tarnish. Miquella's needle is unalloyed, the full 24 karat gold. As we can see, it has snapped because it lacks the durability of alloyed gold, but its power is really presented as metaphysical. It is deeply Shintoistic to imagine a plotline where gold representing divine purity is a cure for a rottenness of the blood. By complete contrast, the total lack of blood aversion is what makes Bloodborne so believably Western in its world setting. The use of blood vials for healing and as important items in questlines encapsulates the experimentation and powerful drug use that characterized Victorian medicine. A final key point from Shinto is that many people have suggested the gods of FromSoft games are comparable either to the Shinto gods or the divine kami. I largely disagree with that, but I'll be explaining why in a later video specifically on FromSoft gods, because that's a whole topic in itself. You must be wondering by now where Sekiro fits into all this, especially given its setting. Sekiro makes no pretensions to universe building, but rather incorporates folklore elements to create an enchanted yet believable immersion into feudal Japan. The folding screen monkeys bring to life one of the best known Japanese pieces of imagery there is, namely the three wise monkeys who see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. This is itself based on old Confucian ideas about harmonious living and comes from a 17th century tablet on a shrine. Their inclusion as a fight at the temple is a clever and architecturally appropriate piece of environmental storytelling, just like the belfry gargoyles in Dark Souls 2. Overall though, Sekiro is probably the least mystical FromSoft title, and the emphasis is squarely on the feel of the combat, but the enemy design draws on the colourful Yokai tradition, which leads me neatly onto Yokai are probably the most important wellspring of inspiration for FromSoft enemy design. Broadly speaking, yokai is the umbrella term for the various creatures, monsters, ghosts and other folklore figures from around Japan. They are still as popular and typical there as witches, trolls and fairies are in Western storytelling. Their flexibility is partly what keeps them buoyant in popular culture. Japanese writers and directors have great creative talent in adapting old stories for the modern era. Take The Ring for instance, which mixes grudge spirits with videotapes. And of course, Pokemon is teeming with yokai, the early generations especially. One of the great favourite yokai has made appearances in the latest FromSoft titles. The Gashadokuro is a giant, hunched skeleton which stalks around in the dark and suddenly appears in all its terror before its victims. High Lord Walne is an absolutely archetypical Gashadokuro, and Elden Ring features them again as field enemies summoned by Tibia mariners. The archive scholars of Dark Souls 3 are a nice example of a lesser known but very ancient tale that probably started as an urban legend. It concerns a real-life government minister named Karu no Daijin who never returned from a diplomatic trip to Tang Dynasty China. According to legend, his son travelled to China to search for him, and after many years of looking far and wide, he came across the strange figure of a man who had been captured with dark magic and used as a candlestick. Unable to speak, he bit his finger and wrote in blood that he was, indeed, the boy's father. It's a fairly common theme in yokai tales for people to meet grisly ends or run into trouble when visiting strange or faraway places. It speaks to a deep-seated mistrust of the outside world that has characterized long periods of Japan's history. Other enemies and characters, though not themselves classic yokai, still follow the conventions of Japanese folklore. Common tropes in yokai stories include objects which gain sentience, long-abandoned weapons and armour which still recall the ability to fight, chimeric beasts who are as knowledgeable as they are dangerous, and animal spirits who take human form to lure people in. Elden Ring adapts a couple of water-themed yokai figures into its storytelling. One of them is how Godwin's corpse has mutated with a fishtail and become like the Japanese version of mermaids or ningyo. You may notice a theme emerging that yokai figures are commonly rather grotesque, and in this instance implicitly warn of the dangers of water. The flesh of the ningyo, however, is said to grant eternal life to whoever eats it. High risk, high reward. The loathsome dung-eater also has roots in aquatic stories. Another of the best-known yokai is the kappa, dangerous amphibious creatures who rip an imaginary organ called the shirikodama from their victim's anus. You may have heard it said that this is where the Japanese have traditionally imagined the soul to reside, although that isn't strictly true. The shirikodama is only usually mentioned specifically in relation to the kappa, and in several accounts its significance is presented as unknown. Nevertheless, this is a popular piece of folklore and no doubt inspired the loathsome dung-eater. Again, the meaning of the kappa is obviously that water is dangerous, and stealing the shirikodama is probably rooted in the fact that bodily orifices are often distended in the bodies of drowning victims. Dragons are another good example of creatures we can broadly group under yokai, but dragons are more complicated and their treatment by FromSoft exhibits much greater attention to detail. Although aesthetically styled in the typical Western fashion, FromSoft dragons have the function and connotation of traditional East Asian dragons, namely that they represent the powerful forces of primordial chaos. As such, they are generally associated with the earliest points of the storylines in their respective games. The dragons of Dark Souls, for instance, ruled during the Age of Ancients, long before the formation of souls. Likewise in Elden Ring, Placidusax was lord in the era long before the Golden Order. At the points when we encounter them, dragons have generally become symbols of decline, their power fading as their worlds are wearily prolonged by events in the main plot. Dragons of Western folklore typically represent evil, or something to be in some way overcome, like the winter. In some form or another, there's always been a heroic St. George figure in shining armour who rides out to defeat the dragon. You will recall from the etymology video that Yori is, in fact, a version of the name George, and accordingly he subdued his fiery foe with a lance. In the Eastern tradition, by contrast, the symbolism of dragons is highly aspirational and tied up with ideas of nobility and divinity, especially in China. One very early Chinese and Japanese story is of a koi carp who, after swimming all the way up a waterfall, was transformed into a dragon as a reward for his perseverance. This well-known story encapsulates the Ganbate spirit and is incidentally also why Magikarp evolves into Gyarados. The divine dragon from Sekiro is probably the only, so to speak, pure example of Eastern-style dragons in FromSoft titles. The design of his weapon is based on a famous ceremonial sword gifted to a semi-legendary emperor of Japan from a Korean king in approximately 200 AD. The seven-branched sword, or Shichishito, appears in very many games and anime series, including Elden Ring as the Death Ritual Spear. Of course, dragons, together with many aspects of Japanese culture, originally have their roots in ancient China. Another Chinese import which the Japanese adapted is the dancing lion. A lot of you will have already seen my video on the Divine Beast where I delve into that in greater detail, but just briefly, lions as a symbol of strength have long been used in the Buddhist tradition to represent divine protection. Their use as guardian figures at temples is shown in the Divine Beast's placement guarding the way up to Enir-Ilim and the Holy Gates. The dialogue exhorting the beast to dance as an emissary of higher spheres reflects the uniquely Japanese use of the lion dance as a ritual, liturgical dance to bring down blessings. And, of course, we saw in the Centrina video that the water lily symbolism is appropriate for a figure representing sleep, as the Chinese and Japanese character for water lilies means sleeping lotus, as the flowers close at night and open to sunlight. These are just a few of the references to Japanese folklore and mythology scattered throughout the Soulsborne games. I make no claim to be any kind of expert on Japan, and I don't speak the language, but I am fascinated by their culture, and knowing these little facts always enhances my enjoyment of FromSoft games and my appreciation of the work that went into their design. Please share any other hidden references you found in the comments, and I'm especially keen to hear from any Japanese speakers what language secrets we might be missing. And, as always, thank you for watching.